Hello everyone, welcome back to Bexhill West and welcome once again to my workbench. Now I've been having fun over the last few weeks working with the Creality Falcon2 60-watt laser cutter, and I promised in my last video that I would use it to have a go at a particular project, and I mentioned that the project that I was going to have a go at was this little model station building. Now I've not finished this was my mock-up that I showed you in a previous video, and in today's video we're going to take a look at this, but specifically look at some of the details, how the brickwork's done, how the corners are done, producing the windows, etc, etc. And we'll look at some of those details and how we can kind of optimise those when designing and working with the laser cutter. So everything you're going to see was cut with that Falcon 2 machine. I think it's brilliant, but anyway, you'll see that through the course of the video, but for now let's get on with the actual bones of this thing, which is to look at designing this little project. Now then, we'll begin by putting this project into a little bit of context, and I'll start by showing you on my computer screen exactly where this model is destined for. So then ultimately this little project is set to become part of a much larger model which is being built for the Scale 4 Society's Jubilee Layout Challenge project. And if I just kind of zoom in here a little bit, you get an idea of roughly what's going on. But for today we're going to focus on this area, which is the station itself. Now this station is based upon Evesham Station, and I'll show you my reference source for that, and we can get into the actual details of how this is going to be built. So I've been really lucky here in that the station building that I want to model has been drawn up in this issue of the Midland Record. If I open to the right page, I've got myself here some decent drawings to work with. Now when I did the first version of Bexhill West, I did that by simply counting the bricks to work out how big everything was, and because there was a lockdown on at the time, I initially did that by counting the bricks using Google Earth. It turns out to be pretty accurate actually. I think when I eventually got the real drawings across the length of the building, I was out by 2 or 3 millimeters, nothing really. Anyway, this is what we're going to produce. Now I made a video a while back now, I'll put a link in the description to research sources, and something that's really helpful is looking at sort of local authority planning records and things like that. Very often you find particularly old buildings have had redevelopment works, and you can get yourself an excellent accurate set of plans that way. This then is my working CAD screen, and you can see I've pasted a scan of that page out of the book. I've corrected it a little bit, sort of taken out a bit of distortion that came from the scanning process, and I've squared it up. And you'll see if I zoom in on a particular area that basically all I've done is, in this case, just simply traced over the top of the sort of shapes as they appear on the drawing. Now I'll mention something here, and I'm quite fussy about brickwork. Actually, as part of my day job, I teach bricklaying, so I'm quite fussy about doing things correctly. Now in this case, this is a Flemish bond wall, and I'll just kind of give you a couple of tips, things to think about. If we have a look at one edge of the Flemish bond, so here we can see the long faces of the bricks, these are the stretchers, and short faces, these are headers. You can see the pattern it creates. Now when you come to a corner of the building, you have to incorporate what's called a queen closer. Imagine a brick cut long ways down the middle, and you'll see those. You'll see those wherever you've got a solid, in this case 9-inch thick wall, whether it's Flemish bond or English bond. I mention it because people do spot these things. Now when we come to look at the side face of this wall, so the wall that would immediately join this one on the left hand face, we need to make sure that these queen closers appear kind of on the in-between courses. They don't line up. You won't see on this course, you won't see a queen closer here and one immediately around the corner. That'll make some more sense in just a minute. Now before we can laser cut anything, of course we need to draw all the lines that we want to laser cut, and so you can see here I've drawn those in red. I've simply drawn them in red because it stands out nicely against the black lines of the scanned drawing below. Now there's a big question about brick sizes. What dimensions do we use? Well, bricks nowadays in the UK, or not all of them, but most of them are made to a British standard, and they're all set sizes long. In the past, particularly pre-war, they might be made by local brickworks and vary in size. To be honest with you, I don't really mess about with that too much. For most of my brickwork, I use standard dimensions of 3mm long by 3mm long, 1mm high, and the thickness across the header would be 1.5mm. Now the reason I do that is because those measurements 1, 1.5 and 3 kind of divide into one another. They mathematically work and the geometry is much easier to figure out. So when I'm making a model, I tend to make each face a unit of that 3mm length to try and avoid any sort of unrealistic half or 3/4 brick cuts and things like that. They're not accurate, they're not the perfect scale size, but they're good enough for our purposes, and if we stick to those basic measurements, we make all walls divisible by 3mm in length and divisible by 1mm in height. It just simplifies so many things as we move further through the process. So this is my screen in its entirety, and what I tend to do is draw a panel of brickwork. So for example, let's take this piece here. I'll take that, and once I've drawn that, I'll move it out of the way. What I tend to do is I'll copy that first of all, move it out of the way, and then I'll deal with that later on, and we'll do some formatting before we cut these parts out. This then is one of the panels that I've created prior to sending this to the laser cutter, and you can see it's composed of 4 squares put together. The overall size of this is 320 by 320mm. Now the Creality machine will cut much bigger than that, but I like to break things down into 160mm square where I can, because I then store the bits in some handy little plastic bags I've got. It's also a useful size for putting things in a jiffy bag. But the reason for bringing up this little panel to have a look at, if I zoom in here a little bit closely, you can see I've used 3 different line colours. So in the case of the bricks here and this parquet floor panel, I've used red. The outline of the parts I've done in blue, and then the outline of these square sort of frames is black. Now let's come back to looking here. The reason for doing those in different colours is that in Lightburn we can order the various colours to be cut in whatever order we like. So in this case I would cut the red first, that would produce like the engraved detail. Then I'd probably cut the blue line and then the black line. Now a couple of other things to look at here. If we take a look just here, we can see there's a little tab, a little gap in the line. If we do that, then when we cut these parts out, they stay attached in the frame. That can be quite handy if you want to just cut parts and you don't want them littering the bench. It keeps everything together and they can just be sort of snapped out at a later stage. And so the way I would tend to do that, not always, but the way I tend to do it, is I would draw a circle, something like that. And then if I delete inside the circle and then the circle itself, that gives us a nice little tab. And in 2mm MDF I would probably make that circle something like 60 to 80 or 0.6 to 0.8 of a millimetre diameter. Something else that's perhaps worthy of mentioning, if I zoom in on the corner of this slot, so this is going to have another part that kind of tabs into here, where we get an internal corner, I very often will add this detail. So if you imagine the laser beam tracking along this line, it will then circle that line and then come off down here. Now the reason why we might want to do that is because the laser will slow down, there will be some deceleration when it gets to a corner and then acceleration away if we just leave it as a plain 90 degrees, and that can just affect the quality of the cut. By putting this little detail in, it just enables the machine to keep going a little bit faster and we get a more consistent cut. That little detail is tiny, won't really make any difference in the great scheme of things. We probably wouldn't want to include it on something that's going to be visible, but it's not a bad idea, certainly for how I'm doing these bits. So I think with that, we won't go through the whole thing, that's enough to get us started. Let's have a look at some of the parts being cut and then how we might assemble them, and we'll give some thoughts to some of the design features that I've incorporated into here to make the assembly a little bit easier. So here are our first set of components all cut out, and you can see what I mentioned earlier about I like to store these things in these little plastic bags. That's why I sized them as I did. Anyway, here are first set of parts, and these are all cut in 2mm thick MDF. Now these ones, I've incorporated those little tabs that I mentioned so the panels stay in the sort of the fret or the frame, and this one I haven't, so the frame comes straight off. And there you go, you can see the parquet floor effect. So let's chop some of these out quickly and then we'll have a look at how this goes together, and I'll explain some of my thinking around the material choices. So taking a look at my little mock-up for a moment, you'll see this building comprises basically of 3 separate boxes. We've got the 2 bits on the end and this central, what would be a waiting room. How I prefer to set about making or designing these buildings is to basically make them with an inner core onto which an outer skin is fitted. So if I, for example, were to take this particular wall here, that will be part of the inner core, and you can see I've engraved the internal detail, so this will be the inside face of that wall, and that would connect to the floor something like that. But there's no bricks on the other side of here, this is plain. So to produce the bricks I have like a separate layer that will go on over the top. And in this case I'm using 2mm MDF for the inner core and 1mm MDF for the outer core. So if I flip this over, we could see here the brick detail, and hopefully the camera will pick up that the internal window detail is just slightly wider and taller than the outside, and that's to give us a little cavity into which the windows will sit. We'll do that shortly. So that's how I go about getting the basic walls done, and the reason I do it that way is twofold. The laser in one sort of pass is only going to engrave on one surface of the material. Now it is possible to line your job up and take it out and swap it over and engrave on 2 sides, but I like to do it this way first because it allows me to build up the basic core structure of the building. So if you've got several projects on the go at once, it can be quite quick to get the inner structure done, and then you can come back to it later. It's good for sort of mocking out several buildings at once. Now what I would do here normally, if I should have remembered to do this before I made this video, and it's another good reason for keeping these things locked in on their little frame, is that I could very quickly, whilst this is in one piece, blow over this with my airbrush and get the internal paintwork all done before it gets glued together, which is obviously a lot quicker and a lot easier. So there we go, that's our basic structure. And if we consider these parts that you saw me cut out just now, this is one of those boxes that forms the end structure. These will glue together like so, and I've got separate panels for the brickwork on these. Now I use 2mm thick MDF for the inner, and as I say, 1mm thick MDF for the outer. Now just a note on MDF, there are different grades of it, and depending where you are in the world determines really what you could get. Some MDF is really unsuitable for laser cutting. Those that are suitable are always branded laser safe MDF. If you're in the UK or Europe, I would recommend searching for a brand called Medite, and Medite tends to be a very lighter colour. MDF can be anywhere from sort of almost like a very light beige to almost a caramel colour. Basically, the lighter it is, the better it is for cutting. So you'll get cleaner cuts with less, toxic smoke and all the rest of it. But do your homework before you chop MDF up. Now, really excellent material is sheet acrylic. That's really superb, but a bit more of a hassle to paint. I like MDF because I find that when you paint it, particularly with enamels, you get a really nice surface texture that kind of looks quite brick-like. Anyway, let's press on with what we're doing here. So I'm not going to put this whole building together, but I'm going to use bits of it to show you what I think are useful sort of tips and tricks, things to know about. So if we have a look at this, we can see how the basic structure of the whole thing is going to go together. These little joints make for really good, strong mechanical, they're just good. They also help hold the structure nice and square. Now, one of the great things about the diode laser over a CO2 laser is that the width of the laser beam, or the kerf, is very tight, and if we're very careful with our settings, we can get these joints so that they lock together absolutely perfectly. So we're at the point here where we need to think about the outer brick skin. Now, ignore this funny shaped cutout, we'll come to that in a minute, but we come across sort of a common problem. And I've seen lots of kits that you could buy that have this particular problem kind of built into them, and I must admit it irks me slightly. So if we have a look at we've got our side wall and our gable wall, no matter how we orientate those, we're going to end up with a plain cut side, and it's never going to look right. Now, one approach is to mimic this kind of castellated joint here, but try to do it with the brick coursing. So in effect, we're making little tabs 1mm high. Now, a diode laser, particularly a low powered one, will have a very thin beam, and it can kind of work. I've never had much joy with it myself, but consider this for a minute. If you remember what I said about the sizes of the bricks, the headers here are 1.5mm thick. So if you're going to use this kind of castellated joint method on your brickwork, and for it to have any chance of looking good, you've got to be using material that's 1.5mm thick, so that the cutouts will repeat in the joints. Now, I've not found material, 1.5mm thick material, that I think is particularly good for this, so I prefer to do it another way. Now, I'll take a picture of this on my phone, and we can kind of look at it up close, but basically what I do when it comes to the corners is I mitre them, or I angle them at 45 degrees, and that has the effect of allowing me to get that coursing to match up perfectly. Now, mitering an edge, it's got to be well, it doesn't have to be perfectly 45 degrees. In fact, I tend to miter them probably about 50 degrees, so there's a little bit of gap behind the joint for the glue to go into. But that, to my mind, has been the most successful way that I've found for joining these things at the corners. Now again, I'll take another, perhaps a little still shot, and put on the screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to see what I was saying earlier about the queen closers. These tiny little bricks on the corners, they're on alternative courses from the gable panel to the side panel. So that's really what we need to do, is to form that mitre. So that explains a lot of the thinking behind the design of this structure. Let's throw some of these bits together and have a look at what the final effect is going to be. So then what you've just seen is my approach to assembling these laser cut structures. I like to work from the inside out, complete all the internal sort of wall finishes and stuff first, assemble the structure in units and then put those units together. Now we've run out of time for today's video, so next time we'll look at the brickwork in a little bit more detail and we'll look at the windows and the doors. But I'll leave you with these shots of sort of a semi-finished project to give you an idea of the direction of travel. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Cheerio.